So just think about all the Netflix libraries you can go through. But it's not just Netflix. ExpressVPN works with any streaming service. ExpressVPN is ridiculously fast, so you can stream in HD. It's compatible with all your favorite devices. If you visit expressvpn.com/majority, you can get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. Support the show, watch what you want, and protect yourself with ExpressVPN. That's expressvpn.com/majority. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to David Wallace-Wells on where we are on this Corona timeline and more. Be back in just a moment. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program David Wallace-Wells, deputy editor and climate columnist for New York Magazine, author of The Uninhabitable Earth. David, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
I think we've had you on a couple of times to discuss climate change, and universally, after every time that you've been on my program, I hear from a lot of people that they are terrified. And I tell them, well, good on some level, because we should be a little bit concerned in terms of, and I'm being understating, obviously, about climate change going forward. And of course, apparently you're also on the I mean, well, I guess let's start with this, because you're not just on the, near apocalypse beat, I guess. But there is a relationship on some level, or at least possibly, between a pandemic like this and climate change.
Well, there are huge similarities and echoes, which is, I think, why I found myself so driven to write about COVID. I've been doing it now, a few times a week for the last few months. And we can talk about those in a second. But yeah, it's also the case that climate change is going to make pandemics like this more common. And that's because what we're doing to the world generally is destabilizing ecosystems and natural habitats. We're doing that through, deforestation and development, but we're also doing it through, turning up the temperature of the planet and making what had been stable local climates much less stable. And what that does is it scrambles all of the natural lives that are living in those areas. And that means that in some cases, humans are coming into contact with more animals, but it also means that viruses and bacteria are now living in different climate conditions than they evolved to. And they, as a result, may change their behavior, some in some quite dramatic ways that could make them much more dangerous pathogens to the planet as a whole. So this pandemic in particular, we think we know it probably came from, some bats in southern China, passed through some, wet markets or whatever, and came through to Wuhan. There's some possibility it may have escaped from a lab doing research into viruses. But in either case, I don't think you can say that climate change caused this disease, but nevertheless, we're likely to see many more disruptions like this going forward, the more that we disrupt the ecology of the planet. But what interests me more than that storyline is the way that, a lot of people have said things like this is what we're seeing now is climate change on fast forward, that we're seeing so much that we took for granted as stable and permanent features of modern life transformed rapidly before our eyes, both, in some horrifying ways and also in some kind of encouraging ways, because the political paths forward that have been opened up are kind of much more radical than would have seemed possible just a few months ago. And if, like climate change, the faster we had taken action to sort of choke this off at the start, the better off the world will be. I think there are a lot of lessons like that to learn from this pandemic going forward. Although on the other hand, I also worry that, by the time we're through this crisis, we're going to be so exhausted emotionally, politically, and, in terms of literal capital, that we may not have the appetite to undertake the kind of large-scale transformative investments we need to really get a handle on climate change. So I think you can read it both as a kind of encouraging story for climate activism, in the sense that so much more seems possible now than seemed possible just a few weeks ago, and the world is acting in an incredible spirit of solidarity for the time being. But it's also the case that this is already a kind of an unprecedented rapid challenge, and if we have to deal with another unprecedented challenge right afterward, it's not clear to me that we're going to sort of be answering that call.
Yeah, it's a very weird. This is obvious. It's a very weird time, but it's also very strange insofar as that, and maybe this is just a function of my job, but I'm always trying to sort of plant a flag in terms of assessing where we're at, but that seems to be very difficult to do, both in terms of where we're at with the virus, but also where we're at in terms of the way that we're all going to respond to this. I was just thinking to myself as you're saying this, and frankly, I had written years ago, a decade ago, had pitched a show that was very much based upon my situation right now, but it was climate change 40 years in the future. And one of the things that one of the ideas behind that was this notion of you make certain mistakes, you don't get do-overs on some of the decisions you make in life. And we will never get back those 4 weeks in January or February where the government could have had a much different response to what they did than they did, or the decision 2 years ago to cut the pandemic response, and that would have changed things, at least I think to some degree. And how dramatic we don't know. And it's the same sort of idea with climate change, is that we just can't go back into some things you can fix and other things you simply cannot. But I'm feeling, today in my life, I'm like, I'm no longer procrastinating. But in 6 months, if I'm in the same situation, I may be just like, I don't care what happens. Like, I'm not going to do anything. We have no idea.
There's so much that we don't understand about this crisis that we're living through. One of them is the sort of long-term effects on individuals. What kind of political commitments we're willing to make 6 months from now, what kind of social and personal commitments we're willing to make, what will the psychological cost of living through all of this fear and anxiety be on all of us. We don't know that, but we also know we don't know some much more fundamental things about this disease itself. We don't know why it's the case that certain countries are doing so much better than others. To some degree, we can attribute that to responses, in places like South Korea or Singapore. They've done mass testing in a much more aggressive way than we've been able to do in the US. But in Japan, they haven't. And Japan has a really elderly population, and they've been doing relatively well. In places, we don't know why, Northern Italy is doing so much worse than Southern Italy. We don't know why it's the case that San Francisco and Los Angeles are doing so much better than New York and Boston. There's some theory that we may be dealing with multiple strains, some of which are more powerful and dangerous than others. There are also possible seasonality effects, climate effects that make it harder for the disease to spread in warmer weather. We don't know exactly the vectors of transmission. We don't know how safe it is to be outside together as opposed to inside together. But we also don't even know how the disease is acting within us when we're infected. When it first arrived, we thought this was a quite conventional respiratory infection that was going to proceed much like SARS and MERS had over the past couple of decades. We thought we knew what we were dealing with. But the longer this goes on, the stranger the disease looks, even to the doctors treating it. So, we were told that fevers were the telltale symptom. 70% of patients sick enough with COVID to show up in New York's largest hospital system are showing up without fever, 70% of them. Coughs are only showing up in about half of patients. That was another one of the kind of telltale signs. And we're seeing all of these other dramatic impacts. It's affecting eyesight, it's affecting brain function, it's affecting smell, it's affecting kidneys and livers, so much so that some hospitals have gone through shortages, not of the ventilators we thought we needed, but of the dialysis machines that we had no idea that we would need. And the ventilators, which we thought were going to be so critical in January and February, when everybody, including me, was yelling at the president to ramp up production of ventilators, turn out to be at best probably inconsequential and maybe by some measures damaging to the health of patients who would do much better on much less invasive forms of oxygen support. So 3 months ago, we thought the thing that was going to make or break the American response to this crisis was our ventilator supply. And now ventilators are totally irrelevant, and we're dealing with things like, why are so many patients' hearts failing? And we honestly don't know the answer to that still. So at every level of this, from the kind of the epidemiological level, how fast is it spread, under what conditions, et cetera, down to the public health level, what kinds of measures are helpful and which are not, and down to the level of the individual infected, there are still enormous questions, unanswered questions about this disease. And that's sort of natural, given that, it's only 6 months since patient zero. But I think that people like you and me who are sitting in the midst of the pandemic, looking around and trying to take stock of it, we have a reflex to try to assume that the state of knowledge today is like a good enough basis on which to make judgments about absolutely everything. And the truth is the ground is shifting so much. I think it's probably not even safe to do that. So, in January, the World Health Organization was telling us not to wear masks. Now everybody wants to wear masks. A few weeks ago, and even up until last week, we've seen large-scale closings of beaches and parks in parts of the country. There's good science suggesting that basically transmission is impossible outside. Now, I don't want to say to your listeners, count on that information either, but it's just amazing how fast our understanding of this disease is moving and how little we can really know for sure going forward.
Yeah, that's what's really been, I think, sort of striking, is that all these things that we're that you've ticked off. I mean, ranging on how it impacts you and what are sort of even the broad stroke principles that you should be following. in terms of protecting yourself. I keep waiting for, was it Bill Pullman who was in Independence Day? I can't remember who it was, but, just to get up and go like, look,